Good morning, everyone. Today, I'll be reporting on Unit 3 of our subject, Preparing for 21st Century Teaching, ICT Integration, Emerging Trends, and Teacher-Learner Interaction, specifically on Part A, Preparing for Teaching and Learning, under the topic of Principles on Lesson Objectives. Before we dive in, let's go over what we've expected to learn from this discussion. By the end of this report, you should be able to first explain the 8 principles on lesson objectives and identify the qualities of a well-written lesson objective. Second, construct the revise a weak lesson objective into one that is learner-centered, clear, measurable, attainable, relevant, and follows the SMART and KSA framework based on a given learning situation. And third, value the importance of writing good lesson objectives by actively participating in our class activities today. Let's start with a quick introduction. Lesson objectives are specific statements that describe what learners are expected to know, do, and value by the end of a lesson. Think of them as a destination of our teaching journey. Without a clear objective, both the teacher and the student won't know exactly where the lesson is headed. So well-written objectives serve as a guide for both teachers and students, giving clear direction to both the teaching process and the learning process. Now, let's go through the 8 principles on lesson objective. The first principle is that objective should be learner-centered. This means the objective should focus on what the learners will achieve, not on what the teacher will do. That's why rephrase objectives starting with something like at the end of the lesson, the learners will be able to. So notice it's about the learner's action, not the teacher's activity. So for example, at the end of the lesson, the learners will be able to identify the different parts of a plan. See how the focus is entirely on what the students can now do. The second principle is that objectives should be clear and specific. Our objective must be clearly state the expected learning outcomes. We need to avoid vague words like understand or know unless they're paired with a measurable action. Because how do we really measure if someone understands something? For example, instead of just saying understand plant parts, we say the learners will identify and describe the function of the roots, stem, leaves, flowers, fruits, and seeds. So that's specific and leaves no room for guessing. Moving on to the third principle, objectives should be measurable and observable. This means that after the lesson, the teacher should be able to clearly see or measure what the learners can do. We should also avoid vague words such as understand or know because these are difficult to observe directly. This is where Bloom's taxonomy becomes useful. It provides action verbs that help us write clear and measurable objectives such as identify, describe, classify, construct, analyze, and evaluate. These verbs show a specific action that learners are expected to perform. So, for example, instead of saying student will understand the parts of a plant, we say student will identify and label the parts of a plant. So the second objective is better because the teacher can easily observe and assess whether the students can correctly identify and label the parts. Therefore, a good objective should tell us exactly what learners will do and how their learning can be measured. This also makes it easier for teachers to prepare appropriate activities and assessment that are aligned with the objectives. To help us choose the right verbs, here's the Bloom's taxonomy. As you can see, it's a hierarchy of cognitive skills, starting from the base with remembering, then moving up to understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, and finally creating at the top. So each level has its own set of action verb. For instance, define and list for remembering versus design and formulate for creating. So when we write our objectives, we choose verbs from the Bloom's taxonomy depending on the level of thinking skills we want our student to reach. The fourth principle is that objectives should be attainable or achievable. This means our objectives must match the learner's age, abilities, prior knowledge, and the learning resources that are actually available. They also need to be realistic within the class allotted for the class. In short, we should not set objectives that are too far beyond what our student can realistically accomplish in one session. Principle number 5, objective should be relevant to the curriculum. This means that our lesson objective should be connected to the curriculum standards, learning competences, and the overall goals of the subject. In the Philippine education setting, teachers can use references such as Milks and curriculum guide when preparing their lesson objectives. So this principle is important because it ensures that teachers are teaching the knowledge and skills that learners are expected to develop at their grade level. So our objectives should not be based only on what the teachers want to discuss. They should be aligned with the required competences and standards. So for example, if the curriculum competencies require learners to identify the parts of a plant and explain their functions, so our objective should focus on these specific skills. So the activities and assessments should also support the same competency. When objectives are aligned with the curriculum, teaching becomes more organized, focused, and meaningful. So it also prevent teachers from spending too much time on topics that are not appropriate or necessary for the learners. The sixth principle is that objectives should cover the 3 learning domains. A good lesson should not focus only on what learners know. It should also develop what they can do and how they feel, value, and respond toward learning. So these 3 domains are the cognitive, psychomotor, and affective domains. So the cognitive domain, it focuses on knowledge and thinking skills such as remembering, understanding, applying, analyzing, and evaluating information. And the psychomotor domain, it focuses on the physical and practical skills such as drawing, writing, demonstrating, or constructing something. And lastly, the affective domain. So it develops learners' attitudes, values, interests, and willingness to participate. So, for example, in a lesson about plants, so the learners may identify the parts of plant for cognitive learning and then draw and label the parts for psychomotor learning, and lastly, show care for plants by affective learning. So, by including these 3 domains, teachers can provide a more complete learning experience and help develop learners intellectually, practically, and emotionally. Let's take a closer look at these 3 learning domains. So first is the cognitive domain, or the thinking realm, covers the mental skills. So this is our knowledge domain. And the second one is the psychomotor domain, or doing realm, covers manual or physical skills. So this is our skills domain. And the third is the affective domain, or feeling realm, covers growth in the feelings or emotional areas. So this is our attitude domain. So when we design objectives that hit all 3, we're developing the whole learner, not just their brain. The 7th principle is that objective should follow the SMART principle. So SMART are an acronym that help teachers create clear, realistic, and effective learning objectives. So, S stand for specific. So, the objective should clearly state what learners are expected to do or learn. So, it should avoid general or confusing statement. And M stand for measurable. So, the objective should include something that can be observed, check, and assess so the teacher can determine whether learners achieve it. And A stand for achievable. So the objective should be realistic and appropriate for the learner's age, ability, and available learning time. So teachers should set goals that challenge learners but are still possible to accomplish. And R stand for relevant. So the objective should be connected to the lesson, curriculum, competences, and learners' needs. So it should contribute to the overall purpose of the lesson. And lastly is T stand for time bound. So the objective should indicate when the expected learning should be achieved, such as by the end of the lesson or within 30 minutes. So therefore, smart objectives help teachers plan appropriate activities, monitor learner progress, and create assessment that accurately measure learning. The eighth and final principle is that objectives should guide assessment and instructions. This means that our activities, teaching strategies, learning materials, and assessment methods should all be aligned with the with our lesson objectives. So the objectives serve as a roadmap for both the teachers and the learners. So for example, if the objective is for students to analyze the parts of plants and explain their function. So the teachers would provide activities that allow students to practice analyzing and explaining. So the assessment should also measure this same skills. So this prevents a mismatch between what we teach, what student practiced, and what we assess. So when these three are aligned, learning becomes more organized, focused, and meaningful. Now that we've covered all 8 principles, let's talk about why lesson objectives matter so much. So first, they provide clear directions or teaching and learning. Second, they help teachers plan appropriate activities and assessment. And then third, they inform learners about the expected outcome. So students know exactly what they're working forward. And fourth, they help us measure whether learning goals have actually been achieved. So in short, learning lesson objectives are not just a formality we write on the top of our lesson plan. So they are backbone of effective teaching. To conclude, lesson objectives are the foundation of effective teaching. They guide teachers in planning lessons, selecting activities, and assessing learning. A well-written objective is learner-centered, clear, measurable, achievable, relevant, balanced across the 3 learning domains, smart, and aligned with the instruction and assessment. So when we master the art of writing good lesson objectives, we set ourselves and our future students up for success. That's end my report for today. Thank you so much for listening.